Welcome to Audit the Audit, where we sort out the who and what and the right and wrong of police interactions. This episode covers 911 calls, probable cause, and investigatory negligence, and is brought to us by General's channel. Be sure to check out the description below and give them the credit that they deserve. Let's dive right in and audit the interaction. On November 17th, 2018, Realtor Jerry Isham and prospective home buyer Anthony Edwards were viewing a home in the West Prince Hills subdivision in Cincinnati, Ohio. After entering the residence using the lockbox that Mr. Isham had access to, the neighbor across the street, retired Cincinnati police officer Thomas Brannigan, called 911.
The house is for sale, but it's not an open house today. And I just seen two male black subjects force the front door open.
After receiving the call, the dispatcher put out a notice for officers to respond to a breaking and entering.
Number B&E 1093 Morado Drive. Two males forced entry into the front door. No further at this time. 1093 Morado Drive, 3221.
Before approaching the residence, officers made contact with Mr. Brannigan to confirm what he had witnessed.
Came up, pulled on the door, pulled backward a couple times to the door, put his shoulder into the door and opened it. On this 1093.
Officers then attempt to make contact with Mr. Isham and Mr. Edwards.
Where's Knox at? I got movement in there.
Address is 1093 Morado.
Pete, they're right up there by you.
This is the body cam of Officer Rose Valentino. Note that Officer Valentino has already drawn her weapon, although no immediate threat has presented itself, and she has no reason to believe that either Mr. Isham or Mr. Edwards has a weapon or is armed in any way. Officer Valentino is the only officer on the scene that ever draws her weapon during this interaction.
Pete, they're right up by your window. I'll order him to come out.
Hey guys, come on out. Tell Knox coming out front.
Knox! Hands up!
My hands up, what y'all doing?
Tell your friend to come out too. Hands up.
Come on out, man. We got an appointment to see this house. Well, people saw you forcing your way in, that's why we're here. Oh man, I don't know. They just white people calling the police doing that. I ain't even gonna buy the house. Told me I'm a good neighbor. He sees somebody going into a house. I ain't gonna buy the house. I ain't even gonna buy it.
How'd you just get in?
He a realtor.
At this point, officers have been informed that Mr. Isham is a realtor and that he and Mr. Edwards have an appointment to see the house. In the 2014 case of Navarrete v. California, the Supreme Court held that information offered in the form of a tip can be used to support reasonable suspicion and justify an investigatory stop. The court firmly rejected the argument that reasonable cause for an investigative stop can only be based on the officer's personal observation rather than on information supplied by another person. The court favored the reliability of certain citizens and circumstances over others and pointed to factors that could contribute to the authenticity of information offered by 911 callers. The court held that statements about an event made soon after perceiving that event are especially trustworthy because they leave open only a small amount of time for deliberate or conscious misrepresentation. A similar rationale applies to a statement relating to a startling event made while the declarant was under the stress of excitement that it caused. Unsurprisingly, 911 calls that would otherwise be inadmissible hearsay have often been admitted on those grounds. Given that Mr. Brannigan is a retired officer who has received proper police training and is also familiar with the area, it is likely that a court would consider his information more reliable than an average citizen's and declare that Mr. Brannigan's observations justified an investigatory stop.
Turn around. Till we can confirm. Turn around. Until we can confirm.
Officer Valentino decides to handcuff Mr. Isham until they can confirm the nature of their business on the property, despite already being told why the men were there. Notice that the officers only needed Mr. Brannigan's testimony as justification to suspect Mr. Isham and Mr. Edwards of committing a crime. But Mr. Isham and Mr. Edwards' testimony that they belong there is not enough to dispel the officers' suspicions. The officers are assuming that Mr. Isham and Mr. Mr. Edwards are guilty and expect them to prove their innocence rather than responding to a call in an attempt to ascertain what actually happened. I have made a video that discusses the guilty until proven innocent doctrine in more detail, which I will link in the info card above. It is clear that Mr. Brannigan's opinion of what happened here dictated the actions of the officers, and that the officers demonstrated a complete disregard for the alibis of Mr. Isham and Mr. Edwards, ranking the observations of Mr. Brannigan far above the credentials and reasonable explanation offered by Mr. Isham and Mr. Edwards.
Did you use a key? Where's the key at? Where at? Okay, have a seat.
We was white, they wouldn't have did this.
So what are you talking about, man? That's a
You got some type of realtor ID on you?
I don't give a if you're white or black. We're doing our job
I
here.
didn't say you wasn't.
It's in your pocket or your car?
But that's bullshit, though.
Okay, you want...
Two black guys.
Turn around.
Two black.
Until this point, Mr. Isham had been the only one in handcuffs. It wasn't until the officers grew tired of Mr. Edwards' verbal protest that they decide he is enough of a threat and that they have enough evidence to place him into handcuffs.
Black guys. I want to go to jail.
Where's the...
Why were you going to jail?
Where's it at?
Break in, then you're not going to jail.
Put me
Huh?
in handcuffs if I was white. You wouldn't have did it.
What?
I couldn't hear you.
Where's your realtor ID?
You're white or black or anything, man. You got anything sharp on you?
No, you can take them and open the jacket up. I got ID in my pocket. Y'all didn't ask for the ID.
Where's your... Do you have, like, ID on you? Which pocket, sir? You've got lots of pockets. Turn around.
Stretch your legs. Yeah, dude.
It's amazing.
It is amazing. There's been two white guys. Y'all really went through all
Yeah,
that.
we would. Because you ride along, you know what we do, huh? You know how we do our job, don't you?
I mean,
It's an incredible day. Sit down here.
It's every day. This is the everyday shit. Every day. Now you're searching it like you got drugs and dope.
Knox, I didn't search... I didn't,
You got an ID on you somewhere?
pat between his crotch and stuff for weapons, but he's got an ID and he's got realty cards on. Who'd you arrange this with?
Are you the only two in there?
And you got into the key box?
Yeah.
We got called and told that you guys forced entry, which is why...
I don't care. So just stop. I don't care. I mean, you have an ID on him?
Yeah, and he's got realty cards on.
Although Mr. Brannigan's 911 call did offer the officers reasonable suspicion to conduct an investigatory detention, it did not grant the officers the probable cause needed to conduct a search of Mr. Isham's pockets. The doctrine of the Terry frisk grants officers the authority to conduct a pat-down search of individuals they suspect may be armed and dangerous, but the Terry frisk is extremely limited in its scope and only applies to the exterior of an individual. An officer cannot automatically frisk everyone lawfully stopped under the Terry doctrine. In addition to reasonable suspicion that criminal activity is afoot, the officer must also be able to articulate reasonable suspicion that the suspect is armed and dangerous. Officer safety alone will not justify a frisk. The officer must be able to articulate why officer safety was an issue and exactly what risk or danger to the officer or others existed. Officer Valentino began her search by going directly into the pockets of Mr. Isham without probable cause to do so.
Take a deep breath and relax. That's up to you. We have nothing to do with what you buy and what you don't buy.
I live right around the corner.
To your surprise, there are a lot of houses that you've broken into. When someone sees what they believe is that, we have to look into it. That's what we have to do. We have to look into it. We don't know who you are.
No, I'm talking about you. I'm talking about what is the cause you make the point? So us get
That's not what was reported to us.
I understand what was reported.
Do you have the key to the lockbox on you? Is it in there?
Why we approach things a certain way. Your race has nothing to do with it.
Hey, which pocket is it?
I don't know.
break the fall. Well, they're not. That doesn't make too much sense, does it?
What about the little? Shouldn't it be like in a little?
pocket.
Okay, well, I can't find it.
Back up, yeah.
Turn around, sir.
It is not until a full search of the residence and further consultation with Sergeant Titus Fillmore is completed that Officer Knox instructs Officer Valentino to remove the handcuffs from Mr. Isham and Mr. Edwards.
Again, everything I'm good. Bro, what are you worried about? You ain't about the house. You alright? Yeah, I'm just. I know it's fun to you. We out here. I'll call you. Okay. You don't want to go up there on that's one up the street. I don't even want to live there. Okay. No problem.
Sorry about that, sir. We can only go by what's reported to us.
I thought I had it in my
Yeah, I couldn't find it, so.
Put it back on you?
No, not yet.
Must have left it inside.
It is important to note that officers negligently allowed Mr. Brannigan to freely roam the scene instead of securing the location to conduct an investigation. After releasing Mr. Isham and Mr. Edwards, the officers left the scene without making an arrest or investigating further. On July 15, 2019, Mr. Isham and Mr. Edwards filed a lawsuit naming the city of Cincinnati, as well as Officer Valentino, Officer Knox, and Officer Pete. The complaint alleged that the officers violated the Fourth Amendment rights of the two men and that the city failed to properly train its officers on the constitutional rights of individuals. Approximately 3 days after the complaint was filed, the city of Cincinnati agreed to pay Mr. Isham and Mr. Edwards a total of $151,000, as well as issue an official apology and implement implicit bias training for all city employees. Overall, Officers Valentino, Knox, and Pete get an F for detaining Mr. Isham and Mr. Edwards without considering the legitimacy of their alibi, conducting an illegal search of the two men, and negligently conducting an investigation by allowing Mr. Brannigan to remain on the scene. Far too often do law enforcement officers abandon the objective obligations of an investigation in favor of the information that they received first, especially if it came from a retired police officer. An investigation hinges on the acquisition of clues and the equal consideration of all aspects of the scenario in question. The streamlining of police duties and the improper training of officers has created a divide between the philosophical nature of law enforcement and its practical application on the streets. Many officers simply want to get their job done and move on to the next call, which often results in negligent investigations and improper policing. Perhaps the greatest failure of the officers involved in this interaction was the utter disregard for the fundamental principles of law enforcement. Mr. Edwards gets an A- and Mr. Isham gets an A+. Although both men composed themselves relatively well during this encounter, Mr. Isham was extremely collected and remained silent as much as possible. Mr. Edwards was fairly calm for being unexpectedly held at gunpoint, but he was certainly more vocal about his disdain for the officer's actions and chose not to invoke his right to remain silent. This type of behavior can often lead to further instigation and sometimes can result in a loss of life or lawsuit due to the reckless nature of emotionally charged speech. It is always best to remain silent as much as possible within reason. I commend Mr. Isham and Mr. Edwards for taking legal action against the officers and the city, and for ultimately being an agent of change in regards to the implicit bias training undergone by the public employees of Cincinnati. Let us know if there's an interaction or legal topic you would like us to cover in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more police interaction content.